Hello and welcome to Contemplations. I'm Josh and I am joined by John.
Hello, Lotus Eaters.
And what we are going to talk about today is the culture and politics of South Korea. And you actually have experience of living there. So I'm going to be relying on you very much for this because I've never even visited. And I feel like it's a little bit insincere to talk about a country that I've just spent time researching over the internet. So it's good to have someone with on-the-ground knowledge.
Thanks very much. Yes, I lived there for 3 months and I've been there many times. So I have some knowledge, though I don't claim to be an overall expert on the country. I'm sure between the two of us we can do justice to it.
Mm-hmm. So why do you think it's valuable to talk about South Korea?
Well, South Korea may look like a relatively small speck on the map, but in fact it has extremely large geographical and economic significance. Most people nowadays will have at least one Samsung or LG product in their homes. And the story of how that got there, I think, is useful. South Korea is also bordering on North Korea, which turns up in the news almost every year, usually in slow news season, but it's one of the standout nuclear-armed anti-Western nations that we want to keep an eye on. So because of all of this, I think it's useful to keep an eye on what's happening in South Korea, as well as its geographical proximity to China, of course.
Mm-hmm. And there's also lots of interesting elements in that they've somewhat westernized, but also there's lots of interesting idiosyncrasies where things very much deviate from what we know of in kind of Europe and North America.
Absolutely. They do have their own culture, and it is not Japanese culture, it is not Chinese culture, it is Korean culture, and I think that'll be very interesting to get into.
Mm-hmm. So first and foremost, of course, it's probably a good idea to show you where it is. So there we go. As you can see on screen, there is a map where you can see South Korea kind of there in a peninsula off the coast of China and between Japan, which of course historically very important because those two foreign powers have had a lot of influence over Korean politics over the years.
It's kind of an island at this point as well, if you think about it, because North Korea is basically cut off. You can basically consider it impassable terrain, and then you have South Korea floating in the middle of the sea.
Yeah, I didn't think about it like that, but that's a fair point because, of course, they're not going to have a nice porous border with the North Koreans, are they?
You can say that again.
So, if we move on to the more detailed map, this is a terrain map. There is a pretty detailed impression you can get there about, so you can see on the kind of east, it's very mountainous and kind of in the south on Jeju Island, and you can also see a little bit in the south as well.
So South Korea is quite hilly. It does have some mountain ranges, but mainly it's fairly flat, hilly terrain, which will come in important when we talk about the military history of this region.
So, coincidentally, this was the only terrain map that I could find which has all of this kind of detail on it, but they've pointed out something that's very interesting here, which I'm going to talk about kind of a little bit out of place because we're kind of talking about the geography at the minute.
Yeah.
But I'm going to talk about the ferry sinking just because it's there nice and neatly on the map already. So we
this
have
is
an
a
idea.
massive scandal in Korean politics. You may remember it from the international news. We're talking nearly 8 years ago now.
Yeah, it's as it says there on the 4th or the 16th of the 4th, 2014. They've got the American date there, which is the wrong way around, of course. So the ferry itself was called the MV Sewol. Is that
Sewol?
Sewol. Okay, I'm going to probably butcher a few.
Just go straight through it.
Okay, I'm going to turn to you every time I say something to correct me. So
I think that might get obnoxious for the viewers, but we'll try our best.
So this ferry was about 18 years old, relatively dilapidated, and it was illegally modified. So the actual gross tonnage increased from about 239 tons to about 6,825.
Increased by 239 tons.
Sorry.
That would be a ridiculous expansion.
It'd
be like 20 times larger. No, it's a significant increase. But
yes. So the capacity increased by 116 people to 956, including the crew. And the modifications, this is the most important part, resulted in the centre of gravity being moved by around 0.5 of a metre to its side. So it didn't have a centre of balance that was in the centre of the ship like you would want for any ship. So They also the budget for the
Oh my
safety
God.
training of the crew was only $2. So that probably helps explain why things got as they did.
And apparently that was used to buy a paper certificate.
Yes, it was.
Oh
So
my goodness. That's
relatively
that's the
expensive
East Asian
certificate.
approach to health and safety right there.
You only pay for the certificate. You don't actually do the training. So when the Seawall departed, it was carrying 443 passengers, 33 crew, and a total of 2,142.7 tons of cargo, which included 185 cars. So obviously the ship sinking and the fact it was a foggy day, lots of the crew were kind of part-time or temporary workers. I think eventually it resulted in the ferry capsizing.
Yes, but if you look at the terrain around there, you'll notice that it's lots of little islands and rocks and reefs, so it's quite treacherous terrain, and I believe it struck a rock and capsized.
Yeah. So this resulted in 299 deaths, and 250 of which were second-year high school students. So obviously lots of young people on this ferry as well, and I think they were on a trip to, was it Jeju Island?
Yes.
So they were on a school trip, as far as I'm aware, and unfortunately they were on the ferry as it fell. But there's lots of speculation as to
why this happened.
Yeah.
And it had a seismic effect on Korean politics, which we will get into later on. So just put a pin in this one for now.
But I think it's worth mentioning at least the interpretation that it's a mass child sacrifice. You know a little bit about this, so I'll leave that to
so
you.
there was a popular narrative particularly in 2017, that because the Prime Minister at the time was incapacitated with her personal advisor, something of a Korean Rasputin at the time. She was in this meeting for 7 hours and couldn't be reached while the sinking was happening. Many Koreans appear to believe that this was a child sacrifice to the strange sort of culty Christian Confucian religion that the president, at the time was involved in. Which, when I encountered this theory, was quite wild. I think you'd agree that's a pretty wild conspiracy theory, but it is at the time had a lot more traction, don't know about now, than you would imagine for a conspiracy theory of that sensational nature.
Well, we'll get on to why it might have got so much traction, because this Rasputin figure is someone we're going to touch on later when we talk about some of the politics. But I don't want to spoil it now.
No, but it's good. It's very juicy.
So moving on to some of the other areas, of course, the Jeju Island is known for its volcano. It's known as the Halasan volcano.
Mount Halasan, usually. Yeah. Very nice place. I've climbed it myself. It was foggy. I couldn't see that pull. I was very annoyed. But yeah, it's a lovely place. It's got an interesting history, Jeju Island, because it's an island sort of out in the middle of nowhere between Korea, Japan, and China. And a lot of shipwrecked sailors have crashed and landed and settled there over the time. So it's believed to have a greater deal of genetic diversity, for example, than the surrounding land masses. There's also the fact that it lies, I believe, on a triple point between three regions of climate. So in the south, you've got a more tropical climate. In the north, you've got the more benign Korean climate and so on. But that's just a brief summary of Jeju.
But it seems to hold a large sway in the Korean consciousness almost,
Absolutely.
doesn't it?
I'm never entirely sure why, but it's seen as something of a resort town by Koreans. It's a lot of people go there when they retire. They want to obviously stay in Korea, but they want to go somewhere which is associated with nature and all of this. And Jeju Island is the number one pick.
I think it's got lots of national parks there, hasn't it? For example.
Yes, Halasan itself is a big national park, and it is very pretty. If you go into the outlying regions, you've got a lot of black basaltic rock going on for miles and miles, which is quite an impressive biome, I would say.
And of course, the volcano is dormant as well. The large shield volcano, I don't think it's erupted for quite some time now. Just worth adding in case you wanted to visit.
I don't know. A geologist once told me that every seismologist knows that a volcano is never dormant.
Okay.
It just hasn't erupted. It's active, just hasn't erupted for a while.
That's somewhat concerning. Okay. Yeah. I could have done without knowing that.
There are no volcanoes near us, thankfully.
The capital and most populous city is Seoul, with a population of almost 10 million. I think as of 2020, it was just over 9.5 million, at least that they know of course. There's difficulty calculating population figures, but there you go.
It's a colossal metropolis.
Yes, it's, I suppose, comparable in population size to that of London, maybe. And of course, as you can see on screen, very developed, looks like a Western nation as much as any other, really.
Yes, it does. There is an old Korean saying, going back to medieval times, which runs something along the lines of, if you have to crawl on your hands and knees, get yourself to Seoul. Because the idea was that this area is the capital. It's where you go to make yourself, to make money, to have success. And if you're stuck out in the countryside, you're never going to get anywhere. So that partly explains why there's been this enormous concentration of people in this one city.
Well, I think that's something that's very universal, isn't it? I mean, we get that a lot in the UK, where lots of people go to London. I know most of my friends have moved to London, for example, so I know it's certainly got the draw. That's all right. It's only an hour on the train, isn't it? So
yeah.
So the entire country has a population of 52 million nationwide as well.
Which is slightly less than the population of Britain. We're about, 66 million?
Yeah, something like that. Probably soon approaching 70 million, although I don't know how COVID's affected all of that.
Well, we have to wait for the census to come out this year.
Yeah, that's true. So what I wanted to do was talk a little bit about the history, and I have gone through and meticulously picked out the parts that I thought could create a coherent narrative from about the Middle Ages onwards. So this took quite a while. So the first thing I wanted to mention is the Choson Dynasty. Is that
Chosun?
Chosun, okay. Which was from 1392 to 1897. And in 1897, they, rather than being overthrown or anything, they transitioned to the Korean Empire, despite gaining no extra land, which was relatively short-lived because it ended in 1910, but I'm not going to spoil that yet. There's a lot more to talk about. So I've forgotten. Chosun took over from the Goryeo, who ruled
Don't even
from...
try.
No?
But Goryeo is that's where the name Korea comes from. It's because the earliest records come from when Korea was Goryeo. And
it does sound quite similar.
Yeah.
It's funny, when I was actually preparing this, I thought, that kind of does sound similar when you say it, doesn't it? And it's just like, So it is actually the case. So that's
as
good.
far as I'm aware, yes.
So they ruled from 918 to 1392, and what happened was a gentleman with an army, I'm not even going to try to pronounce his name. There we go. With an army tried to invade the Ming dynasty in China, but rather than invading them, he turned his army around and took over and carried out a coup instead.
I mean, that's probably the safest option. I think Korea is much more easily conquered than the entirety of Ming China.
Yes.
So good old Yi there. Used
I
his
think
noodle.
that was pretty wise, because I'd imagine he was probably being sent to his death, right?
Yeah, sounds like it.
So this transition between two different dynasties saw an end to what was dubbed as the Golden Age of Buddhism in South Korea, and instead they kind of transitioned to a Neo-Confucian religion, which I think kind of remains somewhat in the culture.
Yes, absolutely. It does. This is a very interesting transition as well for women, whose role in society was massively decreased in the transition from Goryeo to Chosun. And this has ramifications throughout Korean society. But if you're into watching K-drama, for example, Korean historical dramas, that sort of thing, the only period which Korea really talks about is this Chosun period, which lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years. As you say, from basically 1400 to 1900, that's 500 years. And so all of the Korean clothing and artistry and architecture that you see in these K-dramas is usually from that period.
It's quite a large period of continuity, really, because
it is,
especially considering their geography, where they are between the kind of Japan and China, you'd imagine that there would be a lot of outside influence. And we come to see that actually in the Choson Dynasty. There were invasions from the Japanese. the later Jin dynasty, which is more or less the Mongols, as you would probably know them.
I would not call them the Mongols.
No?
They were more like the Jurchens, I understand, and they are the precursors to the Qing, who are the Manchu Chinese, is my understanding. But essentially, the later Jin was, I believe, a short-lived dynasty run by Nurhaci, who started the invasions which led to the downfall of the Ming. But I think it's inaccurate to call them the Mongols because we as Westerners associate the Mongols with the Yuan dynasty, which is Genghis Khan and his ilk from about 1200.
Okay. Yeah. And also from the Qing dynasty as well. And all these invasions obviously led to a rather strict isolationist policy because you can imagine that lots of foreign invasions means that you're not going to have a particularly good attitude towards people from outside.
Now, although they were isolationist, they did, I believe, pay regular tribute to China for a long period of time. And actually, a lot of the records of Korea, as well as Korea's own records, which are quite good, historically speaking, come from Chinese records of Koreans going to China to pay tribute. This also protected, I believe, the ruling dynasty of Chosun from the peasants who were not living their best life and often had to struggle a lot with famine and had lots of rebellions and so on because the monarchy had this extra support from China to stay in power.
So after these kind of series of invasions, there was about 200 period of peace and supposed prosperity, relatively speaking to the history. However, this started to wane towards the end of the 18th century. By the late 19th century, there was a kind of rapid decline. And after transitioning to the Korean Empire in 1897, the emperor tried to push for modernization somewhat along Western lines, although not entirely.
So at this point, the whole of East Asia and the whole world knew that Western imperial powers were coming knocking. And this was, by this point, Korea, I think in 1870, they had some skirmishes with essentially French explorers, armed explorers, missionaries, however you want to call it. And so they'd had first-hand experience of the power of Western weapons, arms, soldiers, ships. And so they knew they needed to advance. They'd also seen that Japan had transformed from essentially a post-feudal society into a modern and extremely powerful militarized state. And they needed to counteract that. So all of these led them to really want to modernize quickly. However, there was a lot of resistance from the country itself. So while the elites and intellectuals may have realized this need, the peasants and so on were very much attached to their customs, their traditional Confucian ways and so on. So they didn't modernize nearly as quickly as some other countries might have.
But because of this kind of militaristic and outside threat, it was largely modernization focused on the military and the economy.
Yes.
So having the industry to support said military and be able to fund it and have the logistics and things of that nature.
Yeah, and it was a pawn between three powers at this point because you have Russia in the north, you have Japan in the east, and you have China in the west. Around this period, Japan essentially defeats first the Chinese, which lowers their influence in Korea, and then defeats the Russians. And
this was in 1905, wasn't it?
1904 was
1904
was the Russo-Japanese War, which essentially pushed Russia's sphere of influence out of this area and expanded Japan's sphere of influence to cover Korea.
Yes, so this resulted in Korea becoming a protectorate of Japan.
Yes, I think becoming a protectorate is a very passive way of describing it.
Yeah, I mean...
they were essentially annexed by Japan.
Yes, so by 1910 they were annexed outright, so... It's a formal annexation, I suppose.
Yes, but my understanding is that already in 1905 there were Japanese soldiers in Korea.
Yeah.
They had essentially picked up the Korean imperial dynasty and carted them off to Japan and so on and so forth. So it's it's a protectorate, but it's a pretty kind way of describing it.
Yeah, I suppose so. So Japan, of course, anyone who knows their history, they're not particularly kind to outside people, and they decided
during this period. No.
Yes, not now. I imagine they seem very polite, but they tried to suppress lots of traditional Korean customs, eventually including the language, for example. So they were really trying to quash any sign of Korean identity, I suppose, to make it a true province of Japan.
Yes, they also enforced state Shinto in areas of Korea, which was very controversial and remains so to this day. So they essentially forced Koreans to worship Japanese Shinto. You can imagine how that wouldn't be very popular.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.